This is Shalom World Podcast.
Welcome to Voyage. I am your host, Frances Hogan. Welcome to our sharing on the book of Exodus. I promised you I would give you a final reflection on the plagues before going into chapter 11, because the Lord said in chapter 12 and verse 12, I will deal out punishment on all the gods of Egypt, for I am the Lord. That means I am He, I am El Elohim. I am the Creator. So what I want to show you is how He actually went to war with the gods of Egypt. It took a bit on my part to find all the names so that you would know what exactly was being targeted in every single one of the plagues. And then you will realize that this was a perfect communication between God and Pharaoh. Pharaoh understood this absolutely from the very beginning. And the target that God had was to show Pharaoh, who was responsible for keeping the false religion alive in Egypt and for keeping the worship of the false gods going. Because of that, he was the one who had to be addressed. If somebody else was in charge, they would have been addressed. So everything is addressed to Pharaoh, whose responsibility is to keep this false system going. And so if you are going to communicate with somebody, you have to use their language. Anyone rearing an infant has to learn the language of the infant before the infant learns your language. So God has to come down to Pharaoh's level to speak Pharaoh's language before Pharaoh can actually begin to step up into speaking God's language. That's very, very important. So the very first step, as I indicated before, was the confrontation about the snakes. And you remember I emphasized for you that Aaron's rod, which fell to the ground and became a snake, and then the magicians repeated this, that Aaron's rod swallowed up the others. And I said that that was very, very significant. So I need to tell you that I mightn't be able to pronounce some of these names correctly, but I'll do my best. The primordial or original snake god is written down as Nehebku. That's Nehebkau. So somebody who understands Egyptian will get that better than me. But the very important thing about this god was that the myth about him said that he had swallowed 7 cobras. And because he had swallowed 7 cobras, that he was the supreme one, and that therefore he was the foundation for the authority that Pharaoh had, and that he was the one who had Pharaoh's back, as we say nowadays. And Pharaoh carried the sign of the cobra in his crown. So this was the sign of Pharaoh's authority, and it was taken from him in the very first confrontation. That is the reason why Pharaoh began to negotiate with Moses. If he had any authority left, he would have used it against Moses. As long as the magicians were able to repeat some of these signs, Pharaoh used the magicians. In other words, he used the occultic powers to oppose Moses. But when Moses eventually disposed of the occultic powers, then Pharaoh had to deal directly with Moses, and Moses knew exactly what he was doing. So this was a startling display of supremacy, and it would have gained Moses a grudging respect, not only from Pharaoh, but from the sorcerers themselves and the whole pagan priesthood, because they saw that the ground from under their authority had just been taken from them in one very simple move. And it would have been the last thing on earth that either Pharaoh or any of these elites would have expected. Once the authority of Pharaoh is removed, Moses is actually ruling Egypt, and they all know it. And the reason why Moses is ruling Egypt is because Moses' God is the supreme God. And I'm going to show you in the next couple of minutes that all the gods of the Egyptians appeared to have gone on holidays. They were all completely silent, all completely inactive. None of them defended either Pharaoh or anybody else. But Yahweh, the Hebrew God, the true God, was present and very active and speaking to Moses, and Moses could speak to him. This was alive. This was real. And so the demonstration that was being given was that the false gods have no life and no reality. Okay. Now, one of the things that's interesting, I have to mention another one of the gods, was a goddess called Wadjet, Wadjet. And her duty was to protect Lower Egypt. Now, Lower Egypt is Goshen, where God's people were. So God was going to get rid of this Wadjet and say, excuse me, my people are living in Goshen. Goshen belongs to me. I happen to be the creator, and now I'm going to be the redeemer of this people. And I can take any people from anywhere because I'm in charge. The famous Tutankhamun, who made such a noise in the discovery of his tomb in the 20th century, he had both the cobra and the symbol of Wadjet in his crown. Most of the pharaohs simply had the cobra. They didn't also have the symbol of this Wadjet. So Moses' message was, Pharaoh, you think you've got power over the people in Goshen. You don't. And this is going to be illustrated very powerfully in all the signs that we call, unfortunately, plagues. God's people are living there. The snake has no business wherever God's people is. So the Lord's choice of this people is very clearly made to Pharaoh. This is what you read in Deuteronomy 7:6. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the face of the earth to be his own treasured possession. And in this war against the false gods, the Lord is defending his treasure. So let's come to the next sign that was given to Pharaoh, and that is water into blood. So here, Yahweh, I have to use the sacred name so that we know exactly who we're dealing with, struck the water of the Nile. Now, you've already heard a number of times that the Nile was the lifeblood of Egypt and that it overflowed its banks once a year, throwing up wonderfully nutrient-rich silt onto the ground on either side of it, and therefore made Egypt the breadbasket of the Middle East at the time. Now, the god in charge of all of this was the famous Osiris that everybody's heard about. So they considered the waters of the Nile the bloodstream of Osiris. But Osiris doesn't seem to have been able to do anything about this sign. Not only that, but there was another goddess, one called Taweret, Taweret, and she was called the mistress of pure water. Well, neither Osiris could defend the river, nor this Taweret actually purify the waters. Both of them were completely useless. And yet so much attention was given to these gods and such incredible temples built to them, as you know, if you've looked at anything to do with the archaeology in Egypt. And people today are absolutely fascinated by the archaeology of Egypt. So let's come to the second plague, and that was the one about the frogs. And you remember I pointed out to you the humor with which Moses said to Pharaoh, it will be on your own body, in your own bed, in your own kitchen, in your own ovens, and so on. This is targeted directly at you. Why? Heket, Heqet, was the frog deity, and it symbolized childbirth, midwifery, and resurrection. Of course, this is intimately connected with the Hebrews, where the infants were thrown into the river. And Pharaoh tried to use the midwives to actually kill the children before that. So now he has symbols of childbirth and midwifery and resurrection swarming all over his own person and in his own house and in his own bedroom and absolutely everything. He can't get away from it. Now, he knows the sign. He knows the meaning of it. But we need to know what Moses understood, and that is that he was dealing with a mass murderer. And so the sign had to be something that would crawl all over him to see, was there any way he would face reality? He didn't, of course. And where were the frogs coming from? They were coming from the Nile, where he had committed mass murder. The third sign now makes sense, because this is the first punishment that I pointed out to you, and it was the lice, and the lice symbol uncleanness. Well, if you're a mass murderer and you want to destroy God's people, then in God's eyes, you're unclean. And so this uncleanness is extremely important. Now, I mentioned already that the different translations use gnats or fleas or even mosquitoes, as the Jerusalem Bible does. But lice is the actual best interpretation. There was a god supposed to be looking after the earth, and that god was called Geb, G-E-B. Now, apparently he wasn't able to protect anybody from anything either. And this particular punishment was aimed also at the Egyptian priests, because they had an absolute thing about being completely pure in the body. And so the lice all over them indicated they were anything but pure. And the message is described way down in the New Testament: nothing unholy or unworthy can enter the presence of God. Now, uncleanness would have been something that would have absolutely appalled the Egyptians. They considered that they were a people that had come from the stars, and therefore they were superior to everybody else, and they were going back to the stars. That's why they had such elaborate funerary arrangements. To call them unclean would have been absolutely frightening. Now, the fourth sign were the swarms of flies, and you need to know that the flies and the beetles were popular charms used in Egypt. And there was a particular prize given to any military man who had shown determination and bravery and a refusal to give up. And it was called the Order of the Golden Fly. So you can see that the message of the flies is actually important, because you're dealing with two gods here. One of them, Wajet, that we've already mentioned, and the next one is Khepri, K-H-E-P-R-I. And since this prize was given to people with unwavering determination and bravery, it is totally extraordinary that it is at this fourth sign that Pharaoh begins to waver. He begins to, okay, I'll let you go, and he begins to be very, very uncertain. In the fifth sign, the sign of the livestock, we're dealing with something quite extraordinary, because I hinted to you that they worshipped animals. Now, the cow goddess, Hathor, is one we have to remember, because she's going to turn up in chapter 32 when the people commit idolatry at the foot of Mount Sinai. The authors of the book cynically say that it was a golden calf. In factual fact, it was a representation of Hathor, the cow goddess. And the myth about her said that she was the daughter and consort, which, just like the pharaohs, they married their own daughters. She was the daughter and the consort of the god Ra. Now, Ra was the sun god, the supreme god in their pantheon. Okay. Now, this Hathor was also considered the mother of Pharaoh. That's why I've told you that Pharaoh was considered a demigod and absolutely untouchable. And they actually stylized Pharaoh as a bull. So he was worshipped even in his lifetime as a kind of a god. Apparently, I haven't been to see this, but apparently in many of these huge frescoes that you find all over the temples that have survived, there are giant reliefs on the walls of some of these temples showing the pharaoh actually sucking milk from the udders of Hathor. And the Apis bull, A-P-I-S, Apis bull, was considered the son of Hathor, and it was a manifestation of Pharaoh himself. This is how deeply Pharaoh was in this religion. And this was why everything, absolutely everything, had to be targeted at Pharaoh, if Pharaoh comes down, the whole system comes down. And so if the Apis bull died when the cattle died, then that was a direct hit to Pharaoh and his own person. It is just utterly amazing. Now, one of the reasons why Hebrews were utterly despised by the Egyptians was that they sacrificed some of these sacred animals to God. They offered to God these precious animals. Okay, and that was considered an absolute abomination. So when Pharaoh kept saying, you can do it in this country, you don't have to leave this country, Moses said to him, we can't do it in this country, so the people would stone us. That's not possible. So it was a terrible shock to Pharaoh when he realized that his own livestock containing some of these animals that they actually worshipped were killed when the livestock of the Hebrews, whom they despised, were all alive. The distinguishing thing between the two of them was actually quite a shock. So now we come to the sixth sign, which was the boils. This attacked everyone from Pharaoh and the magicians and the priests and the whole lot of them. Now, boils all over your body says you are sick, but the message is spiritual because it's only a sign. But it also said they were unclean. Now, several of the signs are telling them they are unclean. Unclean in the Bible means unfit for the presence of God. So there were several gods involved. Sekhmet, Sekhmet. This was the goddess of epidemics and healing. Thoth, Thoth, was the god of medical knowledge. Isis was the goddess of healing. And Nephthys, Nephthys, was the goddess of health. So here you have the goddesses of epidemics, healing, knowledge, health, and all the rest of it. And they all seem to have been out of town. Everybody, including the famous medical doctors of Egypt, were covered in boils. Now, why do I say famous medical doctors? Because at the time, the medical system in Egypt was the best in the world. And the doctors in Egypt were famous throughout the known world for their knowledge of medicine, but also surgery. And their medical texts, some of them are still extant, and they're 4,500 years old, and they are treasures. So for them also to be covered in boils was an incredible insult. So that the doctors couldn't face their patients also covered in boils. It was an incredible thing. So God was saying to them that your entire system can come down if I just simply say so. Because that's how creation happened. God said, let there be light, and there was light. God said, let us make man in our own likeness, and he did. Whatever God said happened. And they have seen this throughout the plagues, that whatever God said happened. But they also realized it was only a sign, because when they asked Moses to ask God to remove the sign, he did. God was merely trying to teach them. He wasn't trying to cause them terrible pain, but he had to use the language that they understood. If he used a language they didn't understand, then it would have been a non-communication. So we're told that particular sign was taken from the ash of the kiln in Egypt, where the poor Hebrews had slaved making these terrible bricks. And in Exodus chapter 5, we were told about the blistering, crippling labor forced upon the Israelites in terrible heat in order to produce these bricks. And now the Egyptians are allowed to experience what it is to have this blistering, crippling thing in terrible heat and no solution. In fact, the only solution is that the God who gave the sign to you can actually take it away. So the Egyptians are learning something that's not in the book of Exodus, it's down in the gospel. In Matthew 7:16, Jesus said, by their fruits you will know them. So the plagues are exposing all the evil that was in the system that the Hebrews are actually caught up in. So let's come to the seventh sign, which was the terrible hailstorm. This was a truly terrifying experience for everyone. It was a combination of fire and hail, which destroyed everything, man and beast, that it touched. Now, there was a particular sky goddess called Nut, N-U-T, and she was supposed to protect the whole land from any destruction coming from the sky. She appeared to be away on holidays. And then there was another sky god called Shu, S-H-U, who was supposed to keep a balance and keep calm in the heavens, but he was missing as well. And this plague also touched their belief in the afterlife, because it was considered a frightful punishment to be incinerated or even to have your body physically damaged, because that would interfere with their mummification process. And in the afterlife, you were supposed to pick up this body and it had to be perfect. So there's a little note given to you in verse 31 that the flax harvest was destroyed. Now, for us, we might just say, well, that's just another crop. But what you needed to know was that the flax was required for the whole mummification process. So at this point, Pharaoh is getting desperate. And he makes his first confession, which is incredible. In other words, he's in the right, I'm in the wrong. At least the first sign is given there. So why would he do this now? Why would he say this, and why would he do it now? It's because one of Pharaoh's primary duties was to be an intermediary or a mediator between the gods and the people. Now, the person standing in front of him, Moses, is the God-appointed mediator between the only one and true God and the people, not Pharaoh. Pharaoh has no intercessory power, none whatsoever. If he wanted to get some kind of intercessory power, he had to go through the occult. In other words, he had to use demonic force. So as this intermediary or mediator between the gods and the people, he was personally responsible to another god called Maat, M-A-A-T. And this was the god of cosmic order, who was meant to keep balance between the heavens and the earth, and disorder was absolutely not permitted. So Pharaoh is beginning to realize that he is going to be considered incompetent, not only from his own people and his own courtiers, but from the gods, who will just write him off. This man can do nothing. So maybe he thought he could keep some level of control in the previous plagues, but now it's different. It's now very clear to Pharaoh that all the gods that have been involved up to now are completely useless. Now, this will be taught very, very clearly in Psalm 115, and Jeremiah, I think it's around chapter 17, also teaches us as well. And in Psalm 115, it says that these so-called gods have eyes, but they do not see. They have ears, but they do not hear. They have mouths, and they do not speak. They have hands, and they do not work. They have feet, and they do not walk. And they give you a most wonderful statement. It's very difficult to translate a pun from one language to another. It's very difficult. But somehow Jeremiah got it, and also this psalm. And they said that these so-called gods are merely things. In other words, statues you have made, a thing. But they're nothings. Why are they nothings? Because there's no life. There's no person. There's no reality. There's no truth. But they said, by comparison, our God is no thing. He doesn't have any matter. He's pure spirit. Our God is pure spirit. And so nothing of matter can actually touch him. This is extremely important, because in the whole occultic power system, Satan wants matter. When they try to attack you, they try to get something belonging to you. They need matter to do it. So this is way, way above that altogether. So Pharaoh definitely sees the supremacy of Yahweh. And he sees that the gods that he's worshipping are utterly useless. So the next sign are the locusts. And, in tropical countries, swarms of locusts are not that unusual, but you can have it turned into a plague by simply multiplying it into the billions. That's all. And so the remaining harvest was actually removed. Okay. And that meant that Egypt, which was the breadbasket of the world, was facing starvation. Now, they had 6 crop deities. 6. 7 is the perfect number. 6 is the imperfect number. And these were Neper, N-E-P-E-R, Nepri, whom I've already mentioned, N-E-P-R-I, Heneb, H-E-N-E-B, Isis, I've already mentioned, Set, that I haven't mentioned yet, and one that's difficult for me to pronounce, Ren-En-Utet, R-E-N-E-N-U-T-E-T. 6 of them. All 6 of them failed, or they were all out of town, whichever you like. And when I was preparing this, the thing that was uppermost in my mind was down in the first book of Kings, in chapter 18, when you have Elijah confronting the prophets of Baal. And the Baal, B-A-apostrophe-A-L, was the male leader of the false gods. Okay, won't deal with that now. But he challenged them. He challenged the priests and the prophets of Baal to go and work a miracle in front of the people. Now, he knew it wasn't going to happen. And so he taunted them as the day went on, and they went through their incantations, and they even gashed their bodies and drew blood, as people do in these awful rituals. And Elijah said, oh, maybe he's out of town. Maybe he's busy. Maybe he's gone on a journey. And that was the thing that I was remembering when I was reading this, because it seems as if all of these gods are gone on journeys or out of town as well. They're utterly and completely useless. But when Elijah called upon Yahweh to come and work a miracle for him, it happened immediately. So it's the demonstration of the true God. This particular sign actually brings Pharaoh to his knees, and he really makes his real confession, I've sinned against heaven and before you, which are the words that Jesus put on the mouth of the prodigal son. But the final sign that was given was the greatest of all, and it's the thing that turned Pharaoh again into want to murder the Israelites. Now, I didn't say that when I was doing the 9th plague. I want to say it now, and I wanted to say it having mentioned the various gods that had been targeted, because every aspect of Egyptian religion is being targeted in all of these plagues. The supreme god for them was Ra. Now, Ra was given a number of names depending on the king or the time. He could also have been called Re or E, sometimes Amon Ra, A-M-O-N hyphen Ra, or A-T-U-M, or you might have heard of him called Aten as well. These were all names given to this one sun god, who was the supreme god. We're told that this sun god, he was the chief of them all and the essence of their religion. So when you look at the depictions on the walls in the temples, you find the sun disk all over the place. So when darkness came upon Egypt and light came upon Goshen, then the god Ra was defeated. Because Yahweh was saying, I am the light. Nobody else is the light. And this disk that you are worshipping is merely a disk in the sky. It's merely a star. That's all it is. It is a created thing. They were worshipping creation, and they were worshipping animals, and they were worshipping people. I'll bring all of that out when we get to Sinai, because that will all come into the commandments of God, that he will command us not to worship any of these things. And he is specifically mentioning these Egyptian gods. So the 9th plague was therefore the last straw for Pharaoh, because now he knew that Yahweh, Moses' God, the God of the Hebrews, was claiming to be El Elohim, the God of gods. Adonim, the Lord of lords. And not only was he claiming that, but he was actually proving it. This is what Deuteronomy 10:17 says. For the Lord your God is God of gods, El Elohim, and he is Lord of lords, Adonim. He is the great God. He is the mighty one. He is the awesome one. That's Deuteronomy 10:17. So this is what was being proved in the plagues, that God was revealing himself to the whole world, because Egypt was the superpower of the world, and all the knowledge would go out from there to everybody else. So God has revealed himself. When you go to other books like Joshua, they discovered the whole world did know about it, but I mentioned that to you before. Let me give you a final just little message here. If everything has been done in 9 plagues, why do you have a 10th one? Why is it necessary? And it's necessary for this reason, that there were so many gods worshipped in Egypt that they worshipped them in groups of 9. And these groups were called Enneads, Enneads, Enneads. And so an Ennead was a regional pantheon of gods. But the supreme pantheon, or Ennead, was the one that had Ra in it. Okay? And this was called the famous Ennead of Heliopolis. It was led by Ra, or Atum, or Aten, whatever you want to call him. And he had 8 descendants. Now listen to the names, because you've heard them all before. Shu, Tefnut, Jeb, Nut, Isis, Osiris, Set, and Nephthys. All his descendants. They've all been wiped out in the plagues, every one of them. And so has Ra. And there's only one God that I haven't named, I haven't mentioned. He was called the 10th one. He was called Horus. And Horus was dealt with as well. And so what God has done in the plagues of Egypt, he has literally wiped out their religion, shown that it is completely false. They are totally deceived. And that's why when you go to the book of Revelation in chapter 12, verse 9, that when the devil is actually exposed, he's Satan, he's the snake, he's the devil, he's anything else you want to call him, but he's the deceiver of the whole world. And this has been demonstrated in the book of Exodus to introduce the entire Bible, so that if you understand Exodus, you actually understand the rest of the Bible. It's very, very, very important. Okay. So in the 10th plague, the creator of the universe brings judgment to the false religion of Egypt, to the man who's holding it all together, which is Pharaoh. And all the gods of Egypt are wiped out. A decisive blow is given to the nation. And that decisive blow is the death of the firstborn. Pharaoh and his family were considered demigods, as I've said. They were considered to be untouchable, that what would happen to ordinary mortals would never happen to them, which of course is absolutely untrue, because many of these pharaohs had many sons. I remember reading about one of them, that he had buried 15 of his sons. And the reason for the death of all of these children was because of their marrying of their own daughters. And so the inbreeding brought all kinds of illnesses along with it. So in the 10th plague, Pharaoh's prized possession was taken. His prized possession was his firstborn son and heir. And that boy was considered to be a demigod. And there he was, lying dead in his father's arms. Therefore, at long last, Pharaoh heard. Instead of surrendering himself to God, Instead of saying, if you took away every other sign, you could take away this one as well. Instead of that, instead of humbling his soul, he turned in a murderous gesture towards Moses, which I will read for you soon. Okay, so Pharaoh's son is dead, therefore his own future is dead. His whole pantheon of gods are dead. The whole nation has been brought to its knees. What does it take to make a proud human being bend their head in humility before God? Look how far God had to go to try and see, would this one man actually surrender? It is quite incredible. And Pharaoh is not alone in this. The whole history of the human race tells you that we are all more or less the same. We may not be as bad, but we may be just as slow to bend the knee in worship. And so God did in fact keep his promise. He said to Pharaoh, if you absolutely oppose me, I will bring about the death of the firstborn. Pharaoh knew for 9 plagues that whatever God said, he did. And so he did this as well. So it was only after this catastrophic event that Pharaoh let the people go. And then we're going to see in the crossing of the Red Sea that he changed his mind again. So no matter what happened, he still would go back on his word. No matter what, it is really incredible. So in today's world, we're just like Egypt was then. We have many gods. People worship all kinds of things. We have the vast majority of our societies actually living in opposition to God. And even with trials and difficulties and pandemics and everything else coming to us, do we bend the knee? No. Do we surrender? No. Do we put our trust in God? No. We put our trust in material things and in creatures. It's just the same thing. So in refusing to turn to God, what we are refusing is our own peace, our own happiness, our own health, and our own future. All of these are in God's hands. And the reason why God wants us to surrender is because his will brings us eternal happiness, eternal joy, eternal peace. That's what he wants for us. And the reason why he will send us very strong signs to try and get us to change is that he knows the eternal future of somebody in spiritual darkness, in spiritual uncleanness, in spiritual sin. He knows that, and that's why he's trying to turn us back. So let's read the final confrontation between Pharaoh and Moses. The Lord made Pharaoh's heart stubborn, and he refused to let the people go. He said, out of my sight, take care. Never appear before me again, for on the day you do, you die. This man turns murderous when something really goes against him. Moses said, you yourself have said it, never again will I appear before you. And Moses knew what he was talking about. Now, Pharaoh has made a drastic mistake. He has forgotten to ask Moses to take the sign away, so the whole of Egypt remains in darkness. It's incredible. And so while Moses is moving through the palace in darkness to try and get out of it, the Lord stops him. And the Lord said to Moses, one disaster more I will bring on Pharaoh and on Egypt. Just one. After this, he will let you go. Indeed, he will drive you out. So instruct the people that every man is to ask his neighbor, every woman hers, for silver ornaments and gold. They're going to need this in order to be able to survive and to buy and sell in the wilderness. And the Lord gave the people prestige in the eyes of the Egyptians, while Moses himself was a man of great importance in the land of Egypt. Now, Moses himself was very humble, and he just simply did his job in obedience to the Lord. But his profile before the whole nation, before the whole superpower, before the whole government was at its absolute highest peak. This man was ruling Egypt, and Pharaoh had no power whatsoever. Everybody could see it. He was a man of high prestige with Pharaoh's courtiers and with the people. And so the Lord said, go back, tell him, towards midnight, I will pass through Egypt. All the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die. From the firstborn of the throne right down to everybody else. And the sting, the terrible sting, is in verse 7. But against the sons of Israel, against man or beast, never a dog will bark. So that you may know that the Lord discriminates between Egypt and Israel. What is the discrimination? It is that one group will actually accept him and will respond and will try and do God's will on the earth, even though they're very faulty like everybody else. And the other group are absolutely opposing God. That's the difference. And it's the difference for all generations, for all time. And when we die, it's the difference between heaven and hell. It's a very serious thing that God is saying. So let us think about it. It's very important. And I'll take you from here into the Passover. Thank you for listening. Slán agus beannacht dé libh. Goodbye. God bless you.
Thank you for joining us today. We'd like to hear what you thought of today's session. Share your feedback with us at podcast@shalomworld.org. You can motivate and support us today. shalomworld.org/donate. Visit shalomworld.org for more information about Shalom World podcasts. To get the latest updates, make sure you follow us on Instagram at Shalom World Podcasts. Shalom World Podcasts is now available on all online platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and others.